that study that James mentioned of Francis de Whitbacke, who was the Anglican Bishop of Newcastle from 1931 to 1958. And while delving through his voluminous correspondence, I came across letters between him and the Coalfields clergyman Alf Clint. So this, when James was talking about this radical Newcastle project, particularly looking at certain personalities, I thought to myself that Alf Clint would be a likely candidate for the Radical Hall of Fame, the local Radical Hall of Fame. Throughout his 50-year career as a priest in the Anglican Church, Clint relished his reputation as the unparsonable parson with the union ticket. The novelist Kylie Tennant, who was a close friend of Clint's and a fellow Christian socialist during the 1930s, described Clint's pulpit manner as woeful. But, she continued, hear him address a pig-top meeting at dawn on a grey day, and you will hear a speaker who can carry men away with the grandeur of simplicity. Clint has an entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. It largely deals with his efforts during the 1950s and 1960s to establish what were called Christian cooperatives among Indigenous peoples in New Guinea and in various parts of Australia, including the Lockhart River. His attempts there to promote what he saw as Aboriginal self-determination led to him being accused by members of the Queensland government of being a communist agitator. And this was something that Clint would probably have taken in his stride by this time. Certainly, while he was the Anglican rector of Weston between 1935 and 1941, he was often accused of being a communist agitator. He championed the cause of coal miners and working people in general. One of the most noteworthy features of Clint's ministry at Weston was his decision to join with 4 other Coalfields clergy a month after the outbreak of the Second World War in issuing what was an uncompromising declaration of Christian pacifist principles. It was known as the Coalfields Declaration and sparked an intense local debate. It doesn't seem to have extended beyond Newcastle as far as I'm aware, but it initiated an intense local debate about the Christian attitude to war. So I think that by itself would justify Clint's inclusion in any local study of radicalism, but in fact it was part of really a lifelong pattern of radical political activity. So what I'll do now is just outline briefly a bit about Clint's background, his early life, and some of his activities while he was in the Hunter between 1935 and 1941. His activism can be traced to the ideas and experiences of his English-born father. Clint himself was born in New Zealand, came here when he was about 6 years old, I think, with his parents. His father instilled in him the principles of the cooperative movement, which aimed to replace capitalism with worker-owned and operated production enterprises. Clint was also motivated by his family's poverty. His father experienced many years of unemployment. They lived in Balmain. His parents were devout. They belonged to the low church evangelical tradition, but it probably won't surprise you to know that at that time the Evangelical Diocese of Sydney, or the dominant evangelical party of the Diocese of Sydney, was not particularly open to ideas about social reform. So what do you do with a young man who was in his spare time reading Marx but also teaching at the local Sunday school? Well, what his parents decided to do was to take him to Christchurch St Lawrence, which is located, of course, near Sydney's Central Station. And there, the Reverend John Hope had been rector since 1916. Hope was very much influenced by the example of Anglo-Catholic priests such as Arthur Stanton and Robert Dolling, who had worked in the slum areas of London. For Hope, the Anglo-Catholic revival of the 19th century was about much more than restoring pre-Reformation beliefs and ritual practices. For him, a crucial part of the Catholic revival was challenging a Protestant outlook, which gave priority, if you like, to individual salvation and neglected the work of social redemption. Hope's church was located in one of the poorer districts of Sydney, and there were plenty of opportunities for Father Hope to reach out to members of the city's marginal groups. So perhaps Clint's parents felt that Anglo-Catholicism, popularly referred to as a religion of bells and smells, combined with social and political activism, was preferable to their son becoming an outright communist. What the ecclesiastical historian Ken Cable has written of Hope is perhaps even more applicable to Clint. Many causes were to claim his support, and he took them up rather than analysed them. Kylie Tennant remarked that with Clint's meeting Hope, down the drain went the career of a born trade union leader. But Alf Clint was always fond of pointing out that he was a trade unionist before he became a priest. And when he took holy orders in 1932, he did so on the condition that he was allowed to retain his membership of the Labour Party and of the Australian Workers' Union. With the assistance of John Pope, Clint trained for the ministry at St John's College, Malta in the late 1920s, where Ernest Bergman, who we would have heard about this morning, and Roy Lee helped to reinforce Clint's socialist convictions. But by this particular time, Clint was already drawn to an expression, if you like, of Christian socialism within the Anglican communion that was even more radical than that being espoused by Bergman, and was certainly much more idiosyncratic. I'm thinking of Conrad Knoll and the so-called Catholic Crusade. Conrad Knoll had been a gentleman, was the son rather of a gentleman in waiting to Queen Victoria, and he was known as the Red Vicar. He caused a furore by placing the Sinn Féin flag and the red flag beside the flag of St George in his church in Thaxted in Essex. This gesture infuriated right-wing opponents, and in the course of a battle with I think they were some right-wing students from Cambridge, Knoll and his supporters actually torched the Union Jack as a symbol of what they called cruel exploitation. Conrad Knoll was a founding member of the British Socialist Party. He was an admirer of Lenin. He attributed Lenin's hostility to Christianity to the fact that the Soviet leader was a busy man who had no great expertise in New Testament studies. Like other Anglo-Catholics, like many other Anglo-Catholics, Knoll accepted the thesis advanced by historian Tawney that the dominance of the medieval church had restrained acquisitive impulses and ensured religious and moral ends took precedence over economic ends. But how to get back to that kind of ideal situation? Well, of course, Christian socialists were divided about how they should overcome what they saw as this division between social morality and commerce. Conrad Knoll was disdainful of the liberal and gradualist program of the Christian Social Union. That was the dominant reform body, if you like, in the Church of England. Its members really had no common position on the role of the state in overcoming inequality. By contrast, Knoll and other members of the Catholic Crusade were unabashed collectivists who sought to encourage, and I quote, this was one of the aims of the Catholic Crusade, the rising of the people in the might of the risen Christ and the saints, mingling heaven and earth, that we may shatter this greedy world to bits. So you can imagine somebody like Alf Clint being quite, his imagination was fired by Conrad Knoll's ideas, and the Thaxted Church of Essex became something of a place of pilgrimage for Christian socialists. And from the beginning of his ministry, Clint longed to go there. This was an ambition that he actually realised while he was the rector of Weston. In 1938, he secured permission from his bishop, Francis de Roubaix, to take leave and to work as a kitchen hand aboard a liner in order to pay for his way to England. And he spent about 3 months with Conrad Knoll. I haven't found out exactly too many details about Clint's time there, but one of Clint's friends said that it certainly was one of the greatest moments of Alf's life, that it reinforced everything that he believed in. So by the time Clint goes off to join the Brotherhood of the Good Shepherd in the Diocese of Bathurst in 1929, so when he was deacon before he was priest, he was already inspired by Conrad Knoll's ideas. By the time he'd been there 5 years, in 1935, Francis de Roubaix, Bishop of Newcastle, asked Tom Amor, the principal of the Brotherhood, whether he thought Clint would make a suitable priest in a working-class parish. He certainly is radical in his interpretation of the gospel, in which he believes intensely, noted Amor. In an otherwise glowing appraisal of Clint's character and sense of vocation, Moore noted that as a deacon in the Brewarrina district, where we have large company stations to visit, he was not a success. What Moore did not tell the fact was that one grazier was so riled by Clint's advocacy of the cause of underpaid shearers that he's ready to take a stock with him. Nor did the principle of the Brotherhood mention that many stock owners actually blamed Alf for the 1930 shearers' strike in Brewarrina. That is actually a bit of an exaggeration because the dispute, as I understand, started in Queensland. But Alf Clint was on the organising committee of the strike, so it was very much identified with it. What the principle of Brotherhood did not tell Bishop Batty was that the police had visited Alf at his Brewarrina rectory after being told that he was concealing their sticks of dynamite blowing up a nearby bridge to prevent the arrival of non-union labour. I haven't read any denials, but it certainly adds colour to what was already a pretty colourful career by the time he got to Western in 1935. Now, of course, by that time, the recovery from the Depression, at least nationally, was well underway. But in the coalfields, of course, unemployment remained particularly high among adolescent males. The Western branch of the unemployed workers movement had a membership that numbered in the hundreds in 1935. And these members were hardly a natural audience for a Church of England priest. Memories of the lockout, memories of Rothbury were still vivid. Jim Comerford, who had witnessed the Rothbury riot when he was 16 years old as a pit boy, had not forgotten the Church's indifference to the plight of miners on the coalfields. And he wrote after Clint's death in 1980 that in fact he was greeted with some hostility and scepticism. Comerford said, "We girded our loins to do battle with him." However, Comerford and his colleagues were taken by surprise when the new rector lost very little time in identifying himself with the unemployed and local unionists. Comerford wrote, "He broke across our defensive semi-hostility by seeking us out to spell for all to see that here amongst the lowest suffering echelons in a society and economy gone mad, he was at home." And he certainly was at home. He frequented the local pub, often when the miners were taking their black pint, and he would pressure Comerford to go along with him. This caused some difficulties for the future General Secretary of the Miners' Federation because, as you recall, so there was the local priest happily stuck into a pint with the best of them, and there was me, leading town leftist and temperance advocate, sipping lemonade. There was some wide-eyed goggling at that association of contradictions, said At Western, Clint introduced his congregation to the principles of Comrade Noel's Catholic Crusade, and he delivered a sermon in mid-1936 in which he denounced the way in which what he called institutionalism in the Anglican Church had stifled the egalitarian essence of Christianity. Others were unsettled by Clint's advanced Anglo-Catholicism. He introduced a crucifix, he introduced additional candlesticks. All of these were hugely significant, particularly to the more Protestant members of the congregation, some of whom were working class. In fact, one of those who complained about his Romanising tendencies was the church warden who happened to be unemployed. He actually went to the bishop and said, "Well, we like our new rector. He does identify with the cause of the unemployed, but we're a bit worried about his ecclesiastical tendencies." Another radical step, and it was, even in a community like Western, that Clint took, was to omit prayers for the royal family at evensong. And in 1936, he failed to hold a memorial service for the late King George V. And this intensified suspicions about him. Bishop Batty told Clint that he risked jeopardising his pastoral relationship with some of his parishioners by promoting his Anglo-Catholicism to aggressively anti-socialist principles. But Batty did defend Clint against accusations that he was a communist in any discreditable sense of the word. By that, of course, he wasn't an atheist and a materialist, so that was fine. And in fact, his views of the creed were quite orthodox as far as Batty was concerned. And it didn't stop Batty from appointing Clint to the Committee of the Industrial Christian Fellowship, which was a movement, a British-based movement set up to study social problems in the diocese. The letters that the two men exchanged are quite interesting. Clint is always very forthright about where he stands on political matters. On the question of poverty, he wrote, unemployment and my attitude towards the present system, and even British imperialism, Clint wrote to Batty in January 1938, I find myself on the side of Christian revolutionaries and thus support the move towards the left and socialism, unquote. So it's not hard to imagine how Batty, remembered among his friends a former Viceroy of India, and was visibly telling his congregation at Christchurch Cathedral, as most other Anglican bishops were, that the British Empire was the last best hope against Nazism and other forms of totalitarianism. Clint did his best to facilitate the shift towards the left within his own church. He set up apparently a local Christian socialist group at Weston. There seems to be some suggestion, I don't know if you talked about this earlier today, but Joan Mansfield, in her thesis on social attitudes within the Anglican Church, she talks about Clint being very active in the coalfields and visiting other parishes and setting up Christian socialist discussion groups. And one of the other things that was quite daring was that Clint never had any hesitation about associating with communist groups, such as the United Front, the Committee for the Defence of Democratic Rights, and the Movement Against War and Fascism. Together with these groups, Clint's Christian socialists protested against the inequitable treatment of the unemployed on the coalfields. They became involved in anti-eviction campaigns at Weston. They also participated in the annual May Day March. And once again, Jim Wafer talks about how startling this was in the late 1930s. The shock of seeing, quote, clergymen in full priestly robes marching under a banner which a cross was superimposed upon a hammer and sickle. Their slogan is called Peace, Anti-Fascism, Full Employment and Social Reform. In those May days, Alf was radiant. I think Colin Tennant was quite wrong. He didn't give up his trade union, his opportunity to become a trade union leader. I'll just finish off because I'm going to going over time here. I mentioned at the beginning that in common with other radical Christian socialists in the 30s, Clint became a supporter of the Peace Pledge movement. Its members denounced war in all circumstances. So at the beginning of World War II, when church leaders, and almost all of them said that this was a just war, Clint dissented very publicly from that claim. And as I mentioned earlier, he signed this Coalfields Manifesto. What he first did was he wrote to his bishop and he said that he wanted his name removed from the list of clergy eligible to serve as military chaplains. And then he signed this Coalfields Manifesto, which declared war contrary to the will of God and the mind of Jesus, and a spiritual crime of the greatest magnitude, standing in the same category as theft and murder. Clint didn't actually write that. It was written by Alan Walker. And Alan Walker had, at that stage, just arrived as the Methodist minister for Cecil. And I think in any story of radical ecclesiastical activity in the Huntly, you would need also to take into account the political activities of Alan Walker, later the moderator of the Uniting Church. He was responsible, I think I'm right in saying this, for writing a thesis on social conditions in Cessnock in the early 1940s. He was also closely involved with some of the groups that Clint was involved in. So there's still quite a bit of material on the activity of these radical clergy in the Hunt Valley in the post-Bourbon era, really, from 1935 through to the mid-1940s. I think that's it.